begin. Okay, dear friends, welcome in the virtual Rudolf Steiner branch. My name is Andre, and today our guest is Richard Ramsbotham. Um Richard was born in 1962 and lives in Stroud, UK. He is a writer and theater director and co-founder of Fourfolding Living Arts, which brings together the exploration of themes and current events with the performing arts. He is the author who wrote Bacon, which was published in Temple Lodge in 2004. Also, many articles in New View magazine on contemporary themes and translations of Rudolf Steiner. Mystery dramas, 4 modern mystery dramas were published this year in Rudolf Steiner Press. I'm sorry, not this year. In fact, it was 2022. Dear Richard, thank you so much for joining us, and it's all over to you.
Thank you, Andre. It was this year. The book was the mystery drama.
This year, excellent. This year.
Good. So I'm not as experienced as some people on this giving talks online. So I don't have any slides to show directly on the screen. I'll just maybe show the odd book cover or image to you. But I can't actually remember what the title was that went out, but it's really a question of spiritual science. And it's frequently said, so frequently that it really struck my attention that there are two great spiritual scientists, Rudolf Steiner and Emanuel Swedenborg. That's something which you will often find referred to because Swedenborg, I'll say a bit more about his life, but he was born in 1688, so at the end of the 17th century, and then lived to fairly old, so he lived towards the end of the 18th century, 1772 he died. And I'll say more, but for the first part of his life, he was a full-on natural scientist, and then went through a change, which I'll talk about, and became clairvoyant and wrote as much, from his clairvoyant research as he had with this huge amount of scientific research. So he's often called a spiritual scientist. As we know, I imagine everyone here is aware of Rudolf Steiner as a spiritual scientist. So I'll just read you a little thing from a book here, which is called Swedenborg and the New Paradigms of Science by someone called Ursula Groll. This is relating Swedenborg to all the could say the interesting scientific developments now that link science with spirituality. And it's has a foreword by someone called David Lorimer, who maybe some of you are aware of. He used to be the chairman of the Scientific and Medical Network in Britain, which deals with all sorts of themes where science and spirituality link. And David Lorimer also wrote the biography of the man who is now the king of the country I'm in. I heard someone else is in England, King Charles. David Lorimer wrote a biography of him. But he does a foreword to this book about Swedenborg and modern science, speaks about his first meeting with Swedenborg. I was immediately struck by the fact that a scientist had become a mystic without sacrificing his reason and common sense. And then he says he founded the Scientific and Medical Network later. They have these annual conferences called Beyond the Brain, or maybe they're biannual, which are very interesting. They go into reincarnation, they go into realms where science, has to recognize other realities. And David Lorimer says Swedenborg would indeed have been a keynote presenter in his day. If he was here today, he would be a keynote presenter, which is, obviously the case for that. And I'm mentioning that book first to just point to the kind of influence that Swedenborg has. It's very, very large. In this realm of science, in the realm of modern spirituality. And you will find a number of people who kind of equate Rudolf Steiner and Emanuel Swedenborg, which, I'll just say straight up, I think the talk will make it clear, but, I have a difficulty with that. They're very different, and that I think it's very important to be aware of the difference, which is, partly what this talk's about. And the talk was greatly spurred by an article by someone called Gary Lachman. Now, maybe some people have heard of Gary Lachman. He's an Englishman. He's written a lot of books. He was a rock musician with a band called Blondie, and then maybe he had his own kind of Swedenborgian experience because he became a writer on occult matters and has written, numerous books, probably 15, 20 books, I would imagine. He's written a biography of Rudolf Steiner, which is fairly popular. I think that on the back of the book, it says it's the only popular biography of Rudolf Steiner that has ever been written, which not quite sure what to make of that. And he's written a full-length biography of Swedenborg and a large number of essays about Swedenborg. And then he wrote this little article here. I don't know if you can see it. I can't see it myself. Swedenborg, Rudolf Steiner, and the hypnagogic state. And yeah, it's from a book called Essays on Swedenborg and Mysticism. And the reason I mention it is because I think it's significant. Gary Lachman is a popular figure these days, a fairly influential figure, certainly committed himself, greatly to Swedenborg's work and quite a degree to Rudolf Steiner's work. And towards the end of the essay, he says, so having established that Steiner and Swedenborg were more or less, quote, doing the same thing. Yeah, that's how what he feels he's established, is that they're basically doing the same thing. But what's tricky is this thing that he calls the hypnagogic state, because let's see if I can find his description. Yeah, the hypnagogic state is a state basically between sleep and awake, a kind of waking dreaming, which I also put in the title of this. So you're dreaming, but you're awake. So you can have experiences that are not in the normal reality, but it's a kind of waking dreaming. Through this portal, says Gary Lachman, both Swedenborg and Rudolf Steiner entered their interior worlds. Dreaming while awake is one definition of hypnagogia. He says that he's so convinced of the similarity between Steiner and Swedenborg that he wants to write a full-length book about it, which I don't think he's ever done, but he continues to refer to this. Well, maybe that's that's enough. But it's interesting because he also, in this essay, radically questions Rudolf Steiner's own understanding of Swedenborg. Yeah, he says quite clearly, whether Steiner's reading of Swedenborg was particularly profound is another matter. And on the whole, the people who do talk about both Swedenborg and Steiner together, tend to come out in favor of Swedenborg. It has to be said. That's my experience from my reading. And for those who are interested, it's quite tricky what Lachman says, because he describes a situation in two different books, which Friedrich Rittelmeyer talks about, where Rittelmeyer describes Rudolf Steiner becoming more able to perceive people spiritually. I don't know if any of you have read this. It's, I'd read it and I'd sort of passed it over, but Rittelmeyer says early on Rudolf Steiner had to look away from someone, in a way to perceive them spiritually. And then Rittelmeyer said as the years went on, he noticed that Steiner could actually not do that, could look at you. And that's the basis on which Lachman says that, so Rudolf Steiner's seeing the physical world and the spiritual world at the same time, which is the kind of mix that Swedenborg was doing. It's not a terribly important point, just for those who are interested. This is the anecdote which Lachman, keeps repeating to show that they have this similarity. On other occasions, speaking about Swedenborg, I've sort of really tried to, show the huge amount of this influence, but I'm not particularly going to do that this evening. But this is a book by someone called Nicholas Goodrick Clarke. It's called the Western Esoteric Traditions, which, for those who don't know, is a whole great theme. It's in a number of universities now. There are professorships in the Western Esoteric Traditions, and this man Nicholas Goodrick Clarke, he's died now. He's an Englishman, and what's interesting about him is he firmly places Swedenborg. He says he's a major figure in this Western esoteric tradition, and he struggles with Rudolf Steiner. Perhaps I can just say I met Nicholas Goodrick Clarke once, and we talked about this a little bit because I was interested. And he said that he'd been reading Rudolf Steiner for about, not reading, he had known of Rudolf Steiner, and he'd had his books for about 15 years. And he said he couldn't make anything of them. He wasn't able to understand them. And then he said that one day he realized that he's just part of the Western esoteric tradition. And he said it all fell into place. So I will open that a bit more as the talk goes on, but it was very interesting for me because, why could he not understand Rudolf Steiner out of himself? And then at a certain point he says, oh, it's kind of the same as this whole tradition. The tradition's an operative word with this Western esoteric tradition, because they're very focused on a whole tradition of thinkers, of whom Swedenborg's one. And oh well, Rudolf Steiner is just part of that. So, and Lachman does the same. Yeah, he says, well, it's like Swedenborg. He questions whether Steiner really understood Swedenborg, but nonetheless, they're both in this sort of half-conscious state, which for those who know Steiner's work is very strange to talk about Steiner's work as a half-conscious state. I mean, it's more than strange. It's kind of impossible to talk about Steiner's work as anything except fully conscious. So that's what I want to try and open up and explore this difference, really, because I think particularly because of the influence of Swedenborg, and I'm not trying to just put it out there. My sense, living with this more and more is, I can only speak for myself, it's also in me. There's a certain approach one has. Swedenborg is a very significant individual, and it's very interesting how Rudolf Steiner helps one to see how that can be developed actually into something conscious. So, it's something also in us. And I think it's a tendency which, do you understand? I'm not only pointing at Swedenborg. I also think it's important. There's a kind of tendency in one's relationship to spirituality and the spiritual world, which I found it very helpful to become clear where it goes into more you could call a Swedenborgian reality, and when it comes into something fully conscious and present and able to sort of take on the present day world, I would say. So to start with, I would just like to say a little bit about spiritual science, Rudolf Steiner's spiritual science. I don't want to just presume we're all on the same page with what we're talking about. But I just want to point to two places which I think very interesting is the sort of characterization of what this reality of spiritual science is. So, as you know, before Steiner's started sharing his direct spiritual experiences, he did this whole work on epistemology, on how do we know things, on what is the reality of our knowing. How can we actually work on it that we can say, yes, we are in a aware experience of knowing. We can actually stand on a real ground with our knowing. And that then develops, as you know. Rudolf Steiner worked on Goethe's science. And as perhaps you also know, when Steiner did then write his occult science and shared, the whole huge evolution of the world, spiritually and then in the earthly way, Steiner said that one of the ways he came to this was by fully immersing himself in the evolution described by Charles Darwin and Ernst Haeckel. So a sort of modern scientific evolution, and then transforming that, taking that scientific knowledge, if you like, and working it through and spiritualizing science. So we don't just stay with science as it was, it actually becomes spiritual science. It's an extraordinary process in a way that he describes. And you understand, it's not just a clairvoyance. Oh, well, let's forget science and become clairvoyant, or just deal with clairvoyance. Not at all. It's actually a taking hold of science and transforming it. And I'd like to read to you a little passage from these lectures called, the English Ancient Myths and the New Isis Mystery. These are in 1918, January the 4th to the 13th, 1918. It's just very interesting place because Steiner describes the whole development of human knowing and human spirituality, relationship to spirituality. And then he comes to the present age, the fifth epoch, as he calls it. And he says, now human beings are shut off from the heavenly forces, confined in the materialistic period. Yeah, we know that. We just have to look around and we see that that's what our society grapples with being confined in materialism. But, says Rudolf Steiner, in this fifth post-Atlantean age, human beings have the greatest opportunity of making themselves into beings of the spirit. No age has been as favorable to spirituality as this fifth epoch. All that is needed is courage to drive out the money changers of the temple. Well, the money changers are also the sort of scientific gatekeepers, if you like, to drive them out and actually transform it. But this age must find the courage to set the whole reality, and thus spiritual reality, against the abstractions, against modern scientific abstractions. So I find that extraordinarily interesting because, are we in a really difficult age where we're beset with materialism? Steiner's saying actually there's a spiritual possibility in this age which humanity never had before. If we can grapple with that, if we're able to take that on, there's something that wasn't had before. And I think if one reads Steiner's lectures or books, you see that. I mean, you don't need to look further to see the evidence for that. There's a plethora and range of experience that humanity didn't have in that conscious way before. And I would also like to read a passage which is more poetic, but is equally striking. And this is a passage from Rudolf Steiner's second mystery drama. It's in the 10th scene of the second mystery drama. And it's where Maria, this is the sort of best, in inverted commas, but even not in inverted commas, best pupil of Benedictus, the initiate, Maria. And at the end of the play, she has a direct meeting with Ahriman. And Ahriman, in a way, tries to outwit her. Says, you don't understand anything. You're just putting out your own projections of the spiritual world, and they're not actually a reality. It's Ahriman's attempt to just sort of throw her and make her, feel she's got no ground under her feet. And this is what Maria says to him. In spirit worlds, there is only one realm where that sword can be forged, the sight of which you can't abide and so must flee from. Okay, she talks about a sword, but there's only one place in the spiritual world where a sword can be forged, which Ahriman needs to flee from. It is the realm where human souls build knowledge first through powers of reason, and then rework, transform it into spiritual wisdom. And then she says, so if at this moment I can forge the word of truth into that sword, then you must flee, father of deceit. And she speaks, and he does flee. But we can pass that over. Don't know how many of you work with the mystery dramas. I've worked with them quite a lot, and one can pass it over, but it's an extraordinary thing. There's one place where actually Ahriman can be fully counted, and that is where we take things with our reason and then rework, transform them. If we do that, Ahriman has no way in, because something's it's been won from his grasp, as it were. His knowledge has been transformed into spiritual knowledge, you could say. So they're just a couple of pictures, but I hope they show something. So anyway, with Rudolf Steiner, we're talking about a transformation of science, yeah, or spiritual science means science itself is transformed and becomes able to apprehend spiritual reality. That is different with Emanuel Swedenborg. And I'll just, say a little bit more about his life, and maybe more will come out during the talk. So he's born in 1688. He's so I just have to find my references, and he, for 40 years or so, he was 57 when he had this big change and became clairvoyant. So for about 40 years, he was a major natural scientist. Steiner's at great pains to show that, he was possibly the greatest. I can't particularly find the reference at the moment, but Steiner's pretty clear. He was possibly the greatest natural scientist of his time. There is no way. Yeah, in the first half of his life, he was a naturalist who stood at the head of the natural sciences of his time. He encompassed them. Yeah, and he was involved in politics. He was a major figure among the Swedish scientific and political world. Man of great standing. So this was not at all someone who was a bit out with the fairies, let us say, which obviously his later work, he would be accused of that. But it's a very interesting thing that he stands on this ground of natural science, which he doesn't then sort of refute. And Steiner says there's parts of that still haven't been followed up to this day, part of his natural science, that he really was ahead of his time, that is just being, shown to be valid today. And then in 1745, he was in London, quite mysterious. Steiner says that the change started because he developed a huge love of his own learning. Mysterious comment, but he says, it's quite uncanny level of love he developed for his own scientific work. And that started to bring about a shift in him. And then in 1745, he's in London, and he goes through this experience. And I think I'm going to read you from his own writings, and you can see what you think about it, or just take it in. This is Swedenborg himself. Because after this, he abandoned all his scientific work and devoted himself to again, incredibly diligent writing of vast range and number of spiritual experiences. But this is how it started in London. At midday, about dinner time, an angel who was with me spoke to me, saying that I was not to indulge the belly too much at table. He was eating too much, and the angel said, you shouldn't eat so much, basically. While he was with me, there then clearly appeared to me, as it were, a vapor exuding from the pores of my body, like something watery, in the highest degree visible, which slipped down to the ground, where a carpet was seen, upon which the collected vapor was turned into various little worms, which being gathered together under the table, were burnt up in a moment with a loud noise or sound. The fiery light therein was seen by me, and the sound heard. And then, sorry, the quote fades for a moment. After that, everything went black. And then when his vision cleared again, this figure had disappeared who was with him. This is Lachman. Swedenborg was so struck by the encounter that he hastened to his lodgings. And then the man appeared again. Now he's a man, not an angel, this time in his room. He told Swedenborg that he was the Lord God, the creator of the world and redeemer, and that he had chosen Swedenborg for a crucial task, to reveal the spiritual sense of the scriptures, which he himself, this angel man, would make clear to him, or the Lord God. And then Swedenborg's words again, that same night were opened to me the worlds of spirit, heaven, and hell. From that day, I gave up the study of all worldly science and labored spiritual things according as the Lord commanded me to write. Afterwards, the Lord opened daily, very often, my bodily eyes, so that in the middle of the day, I could see into the other world, and in a state of perfect wakefulness, converse with angels and spirits. Perhaps you can see why Lachman actually takes this and says Steiner's doing the same thing, when Steiner can, look at Rittelmeyer, for example, and see him spiritually at the same time. The Lord opened daily, very often, my bodily eyes, so that in the middle of the day I could see into the other world, and in a state of perfect wakefulness converse with angels and spirits. And, Steiner also says, he was a considerable clairvoyant. There's no question. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had such a colossal influence. This is the 18th century. It's a pretty sort of, it's the age of the Enlightenment. It's not the age where people were suddenly sharing vast clairvoyant experiences. So it's quite something, particularly with the standing that he had. And basically in his life, he went on and produced this vast body of work. And I know I've said it already, but I just re-emphasize that nowadays, when science is also coming to a certain threshold, and science is trying to, certain scientists take on board spiritual realities, they are looking to Swedenborg as a inspirer, one could say. That's what David Lorimer says of this scientific medical network. He would be a keynote speaker. He found straight away everything that people are now trying to explore. How does one bring together science and spirituality? And Swedenborg then died in London again. It's very interesting, his connection with London. He dies in 1772. That's just of interest in relation to Rudolf Steiner, because, as I'll share a bit later, at the end of Steiner's life, Steiner gave a lecture exploring the sort of karmic background of Emanuel Swedenborg. And he speaks about this once. And this is in London, in late August 1924. It's just interesting. I mean, maybe that's just chance that he happened to be in London and happened to speak about Swedenborg, but Swedenborg had this great turnaround in his life in London, and then he had died in London. He'd come for the last year and a half or so of his life to London and died there. So I could say a lot more, and you can read about his life and you can read the books. I could perhaps give you a little another example of his writings. This is Swedenborg now himself again. The spiritual world in external appearance is quite similar to the natural world. Lands appear there, mountains, hills, valleys, plains, fields, lakes, rivers, as in the natural world. Paradises also appear there, gardens, groves, woods, trees bearing fruit and seeds. Animals appear there, birds, fishes of every kind. That's obviously a very simple passage, but if you do read his work, you find that it's a very strange phenomenon about Swedenborg. The spiritual world in external appearance is quite similar to the natural world. That's what you find. I mean, it's very odd. He talks about finding all the countries in the spiritual world. You know, he goes through them and describes the character of the people there. It's you know, as I'm sure you know, through reading Rudolf Steiner, one's really asked to actually shift one's comprehension. You know, that everything's actually in a, you know, often the complete reverse of how we meet it in the physical world, that we really need to, I don't know about you, but I find it very interesting with Rudolf Steiner. There's a series of lectures that's deeply interesting. And often the first 2 or even 3 lectures are quite difficult and are not going directly into the theme. And this is just a personal sense, but I think very often Steiner's, we're needing to prepare. We're needing to actually shift our whole manner of thinking and of being before we can then come to what he's, you know, the sort of truths he's trying to bring. And Swedenborg has this different character. He does, where it's very much similar to the natural world. So I would now like to speak a little bit about the influence of Swedenborg. And I'm not a scholar, you know, this was just a matter of deep interest to me. So I'm not some historian who can, you know, quote chapter and verse of everything. But I would like to say something about the influence, particularly in the great places, as it were, in the great individuals, which is substantial. So with William Blake, and we'll go into this a bit more later. Here's another book. It's called Blake and Swedenborg. The sources of William Blake's arts in the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg. So there are different essays by different people trying to show how the source of Blake's art is in the writings of Swedenborg. Now that is, again, if you're a great lover of Blake, that should bring up certain questions, because that's a very popular view nowadays, that Blake is basically a Swedenborgian, as they call them. And Blake indeed had a big connection with Swedenborg. I think his parents even were a member of the Swedenborg Church. So he sort of grew up in the environment in London of the Swedenborg Church and used to go to the church and was indeed very influenced by it. You know, Blake's a visionary. If you know William Blake, his paintings, his poems, his prophetic books, you know, he's a visionary. And there's passages that do sound similar to Swedenborg, certain turns of phrase and things. But I'll read you what Blake himself says about Swedenborg after. All right. Now, this is Blake. If you know him, he speaks in a wonderful, kind of passionate, kind of almost John the Baptist kind of voice, a voice crying in the wilderness, which was what he once said about himself. Now hear a plain fact. Swedenborg has not written one new truth. Now hear another. He has written all the old falsehoods. Swedenborg's writings are a recapitulation of all superficial opinions. Have now another plain fact. Any man of mechanical talents may, from the writings of Paracelsus or Jacob Boehme, produce 10,000 volumes of equal value with Swedenborg. If you go into, says Blake, if you go into Paracelsus or Jacob Boehme, you'll be able to write 10,000 volumes of equal value with Swedenborg. And from those of Dante or Shakespeare, an infinite number. But when he has done this, let him not say he knows better than his master, for he only holds a candle in sunshine. I think that's about Swedenborg. He's holding a candle in the sunshine of the real great spiritual light that can be given to us. So that's not quite the picture that Blake's just following Swedenborg's teachings. And perhaps Blake and Goethe were, you know, they're very different. One's the great cultural spirit of England, and the other's the great cultural spirit of Germany. And they work differently. Goethe's a very sort of harmonious, balanced, you know, figure, incredible in all his work. And Blake's a sort of strong visionary who also calls things out. Like here, you can hear it in his voice. But it's interesting. You can also explore the similarities of Goethe and Blake in what they look at and where they come to and how they describe other writers. And I think with Swedenborg, Goethe and Blake are quite similar in that Goethe was also very influenced by Swedenborg and then transforms it. It's like, you know, the simplistic picture, which is sometimes presented these days, is that, you know, there's the influence, say Blake's influenced by Swedenborg, and therefore he's just a Swedenborgian. We can find the source of his work. But actually, Blake works really hard to transform it. Yes, there's an influence, and then he turns it into something else and ends up writing something like this. By the way, you can just carry this till later. Blake also said of Swedenborg, he called him a Samson. Yeah, so a great big strong spiritual figure like Samson, a Samson shorn by the churches. So, you know, Samson had his hair cut because he had all his power taken away when his wife cut his hair. But Swedenborg is a Samson shorn by the churches. It's an interesting comment. And Goethe also, you know, there's no way Goethe just becomes a Swedenborgian. And I will then actually share what Steiner says about Goethe's relationship to Swedenborg, because it's incredibly interesting. This is Rudolf Steiner. The connection between Goethe and Swedenborg is of the greatest interest. For here, with one person, Swedenborg, a road was taken in a pathological direction, while the other, Goethe, with greatest intensity, went in a direction that was healthy. Goethe followed Swedenborgianism only insofar as it was healthy. Yeah, I mean, this is challenging, and I'll go into it a bit more later, but you know, the question becomes about this, you know, what was the nature of Swedenborg's spirituality? What was it? Because it was, you know, unquestionably something huge and influential, there's no doubt. But what is the character of it? And how did it come into being? And in this particular essay here, unfortunately, I don't have the reference for it. I could find it for you. Where Steiner talks about Swedenborg and Goethe, but Steiner speaks about Swedenborg and then says, then he fell ill, in a way, Swedenborg. Yeah, and into his sick organism poured the what he had previously evolved for the study of nature. So, you know, interesting. I mean, only Rudolf Steiner, in a way, can do this. Actually, go into somebody and then explore what's, you know, what's real, what's healthy, what isn't, and where's it come from, and how can that be transformed. And it's very clear that Goethe does healthily what Swedenborg does not healthily. And then Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I'm, you know, it's very difficult this, because I know that in Chicago, and a number of you must be in Chicago, this, you know, Swedenborg has a very significant place. And you know, as I say, you know, again, I just think it's a great interest how this can be transformed, rather than, it's not trying to knock something, it's trying to see how, you know, how we can follow what Goethe's doing, take that path and make it healthy rather than make it something else. So often people say that Ralph Waldo Emerson was also a, you know, greatly influenced by Swedenborg. And Emerson writes in his representative of men, you know, there's 6 people he speaks about, and one of them is Swedenborg, the mystic. and it's hugely praising. It goes into the whole scale of Swedenborg and what he did and how extraordinary it was at that time. But as Emerson comes to the end of the essay, which people don't quote when they just say that Emerson was a great devotee of Swedenborg, they don't quote various other comments. So similarly to Blake talking about a Samson shorn by the churches, Emerson writes, the vice of Swedenborg's mind is its theologic determination. Nothing with him has the liberality of universal wisdom, but we are always in a church. Interesting comment. And then he talks about the character of his writing, which isn't quite free enough for him, for Emerson. And then this character that they're painted in a sort of earthly manner. These angels that Swedenborg paints are all country parsons. Their heaven is an evangelical picnic. Sorry, it's a very, I hope this isn't offensive to anyone who has a strong connection to Swedenborg, but I just think it's interesting. The spiritual world is to him an emblematic Freemasons procession. That's Emerson. He talks about the church on the one hand, and it's all a bit sort of closed and sort of mystical with what he sees as sort of Freemasonic character. How different is Jacob Boehme? Similar to Blake, again, they sort of find Boehme someone different. So it's a little bit on the influence that Swedenborg had. Great, but I think the big people take it and transform it into, indeed something healthier, let's say. Healthier that we can get a hold of and work with ourselves, I would say. And now I do want to spend a bit of time to try and explore with you Rudolf Steiner's understanding of Swedenborg, which goes from about 1904 to 1924, when he speaks on his karmic background. So that's pretty much the whole of his working life. Anthroposophy begins in 1902. The first lecture is 1904, where he talks about Swedenborg, and keeps developing it and keeps showing all sorts of different aspects. And I hope it's understood that there is no way that Steiner is dismissive. That would be impossible. The scientist, the natural scientist, he praises him in the highest way, and takes it deeply seriously, and calls him, a very considerable clairvoyant. But there are difficulties, and so one of the difficulties is that he calls the kind of approach to spirituality that Swedenborg has one that can live side by side with the normal powers that be in the world. You can see it very clearly in relation to the scientific powers that be in the world. Swedenborg doesn't change science in a way. He, there's his normal science and there's his clairvoyance. So do you see? So he has a spirituality which is not going to challenge, let's call it mainstream science, or more challengingly for someone like myself who's interested in the way things happen on the world stage and the politics, a kind of spirituality which isn't going to challenge the powers that be in the world. Steiner somewhere says, this is something, it's a little bit like you can have this the way some people would go to church on a Sunday and then lead a sort of normal, materialistic life the rest of the week. They can live side by side without, bothering each other too much. So that's an important thing. And that's in relation with Swedenborg's huge significance in relation to the stream of spiritualism. So I just have to find the text here that is in English that is not coming to hand at the moment. Maybe I've just got it. Sorry. is not what was well planned. I've lost a text. I've got it in German, but not in English. But it's quite interesting because Steiner gives a lecture in 1905. I think this is 30th of May, 1904. 30th of May, 1904, The History of Spiritualism or Spiritism. And in this lecture, he talks about this whole movement of spiritualism, which, you know, is a big thing. And we could have to talk a long time about how we define spiritualism, but it's, you know, obviously one thinks of mediums and, you know, a certain approach to spirituality, a kind of channeling that might go on, or just very similar to what Swedenborg's doing, kind of visions of the spiritual world. And Steiner says in this lecture, the person from whom the whole spiritualistic movement, with whom the whole spiritualistic movement began, is Emanuel Swedenborg. He stands at the basis of this whole movement, and he calls him extraordinary. So he's one of the most extraordinary figures in history, and then he characterizes a bit. He characterizes, for example, that he could see certain things in the future. You know, he was able to make predictions about things like a certain fire that was going to happen. He predicted his own death. This is, you know, Steiner speaks about trying to establish what Swedenborg showed. He also gives an anecdote, which is quite interesting, just of someone, a servant, having left Swedenborg in a room and then hearing Swedenborg speaking to somebody in the room, which obviously there was no one physically there. And then afterwards, Swedenborg came out. This is in Steiner's lecture. And he said to his friend, "I'm sorry that I've left you waiting. I had a visitor. Virgil was with me." So, you know, this was not a rare occurrence with Swedenborg. He described many meetings with people from the past, and he says, you know, I'm just speaking out loud with Virgil, and then he goes and sees his friend because he was busy with Virgil at that time. But I think that's less important in a way than this thing of, you know, the whole spiritualistic movement having started with him, and that is acknowledged. You know, that's really widely acknowledged. So I'm sure you all know Sherlock Holmes. I don't know if everybody here knows that the author of Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle, was a significant spiritualist. It came a little bit later than his Sherlock Holmes books. Quite interesting, actually. He also has this amazing focus on the natural world with Sherlock Holmes and his ability to you know, sort out every possible riddle and, you know, who done it and all the rest of it in great detail, and then turns to spiritualism. And there was a film about Arthur Conan Doyle, which is very significant in this. It's called Photographing Fairies, which was, you know, something at that time, very beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century. You know, the time where spiritualism was rife, and they tried to go out and actually take photographs of elemental beings. But we have the same problem, you know, of treating the spiritual world as if it's physical, as if you can take a photograph of it. And Conan Doyle was at home in this realm. And he says totally clearly that the beginning of the whole story of spiritualism, it all begins with Swedenborg, who was when the first rays of the rising sun of spiritual knowledge, this is Conan Doyle, fell upon the earth, they illuminated the greatest and highest human mind. That mountain peak was the great religious reformer and clairvoyant medium, Swedenborg, as little understood by his own followers as ever the Christ has been. Conan Doyle says, you know, he's as little understood as Christ was, but that's where the light of the new spiritual revelation first fell, you know, which, you know, is true in one way, but it is significant. So this is, you know, Steiner really points to this. The whole spiritualistic movement begins with Swedenborg. Then Steiner talks about this issue of health in relation to Goethe. And then as I said earlier, something only Rudolf Steiner can do in a way. Steiner says, okay, let's really look in depth at this spirituality of Swedenborg and see what it is and what its character is. And there's 2 lectures which perhaps they're fairly well known. They've got a very radical title, well, fairly radical title in English, which they don't have in the original German. Community Life, Inner Development, Sexuality, and the Spiritual Teacher. Those are lectures by Rudolf Steiner in 1915. And he gives 2 lectures in there about Swedenborg. And the first is fascinating. He just tries to explore Swedenborg's spirituality. And he speaks about this phenomenon of Swedenborg seeing the spiritual world, which he is seeing in some way, but in the same way as one would look at the physical world. And Steiner describes, the characteristics of that. He actually says Swedenborg was not able to apprehend the spiritual world through pure thinking. That was a place he couldn't go. When he went near it, he felt it was all cold, and he couldn't go to the place of transforming it, that place of the sword I mentioned of Maria. The Swedenborg couldn't go there, and stayed, you'd have to read the lecture for yourself, but I think it's confirmed in there, stayed with a slightly personal connection, not being able to go through the sort of, the sort of needle's eye, if you like, of apprehending spirit through the transformation of thinking. And he says what that means is that he sees the spiritual world from outside, as one would physically. He says when you go through that turning point, you have to read it yourself. He says you're actually known rather than knowing. It says for the kind of spiritual knowledge that Rudolf Steiner has, you have to come to the point where you're actually known by the spiritual world, and out of that comes your whole what your then real spiritual experience is. It's not just what's coming out of you; it's the spiritual world itself, knowing itself in you, maybe something like that. Where he says Swedenborg remained knowing with his own knowledge and meeting the objects out there, and then Steiner says, so why? How did this happen? How did it happen that this was Swedenborg's way of knowing, that it was as if it had a physical relationship? And then he says that there's another characteristic of Swedenborg, which is that he was a man of great purity. I don't know Swedenborg's connection to the church. You've heard Emerson and Blake, mention a connection to the church. But he said he was a morally pure man. So he was not in the least, free with his sexuality in any way at all. He says this. So Swedenborg wasn't, you have to read it for yourselves. But Steiner said because of his purity, the sexual forces, which weren't employed in sexuality, transformed in a certain way and became clairvoyant forces. And Steiner goes into detail, describe this is a form of clairvoyance. And then he says, you might think that means, oh, well, that's interesting. So sexuality is close to clairvoyance, and one can, perhaps this is a path one can take. And then Steiner says, well, you can also say that there's a danger here, that there's a connection between the sexual forces and clairvoyance, and he says they can attract each other. And he says, dear friends, that is not what we're trying to do with spiritual science. Yeah, that's a spirituality which is still connected with the bodily forces, even if the person isn't fully aware of it. There's still a connection with the bodily forces. And spiritual science is a genuine spiritual knowing that is body free, that is sense free, that can then sort of go into a conscious spiritual experience of things. Was fascinating for me, because I'd read those lectures and I hadn't read so much about Swedenborg, is that there's no way Steiner's revealing something which for the people deeply connected to Swedenborg is a big surprise. That's known. at the time of this experience that I, read from in 1745, Swedenborg was also writing diaries, and when they were published, there was great shock because they're sometimes called the erotic diaries. That his spiritual visions were also filled with, numerous sort of erotic dreams. So it's not something that people were. You understand? I mean, the Swedenborgians would say yes, that's true. They would, and they see it as a positive. That's an element there, but it was a real clairvoyance. So. I'll show you another book now by someone called Marcia Keith Schuchard, who's an influential figure now. She's done a lot of research into Freemasonry. She's done a lot of research, huge amount into Swedenborg and she's written a large book on William Blake, which, for those who are remotely interested in me personally, when I was at university at Cambridge, I spent a year writing a dissertation on William Blake, and I've performed William Blake, his prophetic books, and I've taught him in university. So he's been a very dear and important part of my life. So out of that, I can say I'm very unhappy with this book of Marcia Keith Schuchard, because she is one of those people who says, well, Blake was just a Swedenborgian, pure and simple, or complex, pure and complex, is the Swedenborgian. And this is her book. It's called Why Mrs. Blake Cried, Blake's Wife. And then can you see it's called William Blake and the Sexual Basis of Spiritual Vision. It doesn't say William Blake and a view that there is a sexual basis. She says, and the sexual basis of spiritual vision. So, I mean, she's an out-and-out Swedenborgian, that's for sure, And going into Swedenborg, she says, yes, it has a basis. And then she says Blake is the same. I think sorry, I hope I'm allowed to just say it. I think it's a terrible book. There's a huge amount of research, and she's now a professor and very influential in places, but as a study of Blake, it's dreadful. It has nothing to do with what Blake was doing whatsoever. It's what Blake overcame, actually, and developed something. It's a real friend of Goethe and Steiner. But that is an extraordinary thing. So you can see, if that's the case, why then there would be a sort of physical relationship to spirituality. And the plot thickens in a way and keeps going on, because then in the lectures Steiner gave in England, in Penmanmauer 100 years ago, called The Evolution of Consciousness, again, with great detail and respect. I mean, there's no way he's dismissing Swedenborg, but he's now involved in a real, very profound exploration of what Swedenborg's spirituality is. Yeah, I just don't want to flood you with too much to deal with, but it's interesting because just before this, Steiner's asked, what is it then that Swedenborg actually saw? Because he saw spiritual beings. I mean, there's no question. But then Steiner says, and it's complex, you'd have to read it. It's August 1923. 25th of August 1923, says that actually what Swedenborg was seeing was the reflection of the spiritual world in the etheric. So he's seeing for real, but he's not directly seeing the spiritual beings involved. He's seeing them as they're reflected in the ether realm of the earth, something like that. And then he says this. He says Swedenborg. Sorry, it's just a complicated sentence. Coming as it did in the form of etheric images. So I can't make hold the sentence, but what he then says, Steiner says, if one pays careful heed to the warnings of the guardian of the threshold, which Swedenborg was not able to do, one would then transform that etheric images and comes to real conscious astral inspiration. Yeah, so he's seeing these images, and then he says, because Swedenborg was not able to actually take careful heed of the warnings of the guardian of the threshold. It stayed like that, and it wasn't then able to transform into a fully conscious sphere. And yeah, which is quite a big statement in a way. This not encountering the guardian of the threshold, and that, you know, what the consequences of that are. And then in London in 1924, as I mentioned, Rudolf Steiner then gives this lecture exploring Swedenborg's karmic background. And maybe we can talk about it in questions if people are interested. I don't particularly want to go into it now because it's sort of that, you know, opens up lots of questions, which I don't really want to do, but it shows that the consistency of Steiner's research actually comes to the point of being able to speak about him in his previous lives. It's interesting that Swedenborg doesn't come to be, you know, to the point of, I don't think Swedenborg actually, you know, thought reincarnation was a reality. And certainly doesn't come to the point of being able to research it. You know, that's really very high level indeed. But it's perhaps something, a little bit of help for these etheric images is that you remember this passage where Steiner describes Swedenborg meeting Virgil. Yeah, I'm saying, sorry, I had a visit from Virgil. Well, he then, Steiner describes what's happening there. And he says what's happening is that Swedenborg is seeing into the Akashic record where individuals from the past are. Yeah, so he might see Virgil. But he said that, and that image of Virgil in the Akashic realm might speak to him. You know, and there might be a meeting, but that's not actually the same as the real individuality of Virgil. I mean, it's complex. It's complex. It's going to this realm where there are these etheric images, rather than actually piercing through to meet the real individuality. I'm only saying it now because it's interesting with being able to research karma, as Rudolf Steiner was able to do, where he's not just the image of someone in the astral world or the Akashic realm, but actually coming through to see the real individuality. So it's a little bit on Rudolf Steiner's work over years, going into Swedenborg. And now, I'm sure you saw, this is a tongue twister, I'm sure you saw in the title that I also mentioned Johannes Thomasius from Steiner's mystery dramas. And one of the reasons for mentioning him was that in the fourth mystery drama of Rudolf Steiner, there's a whole thing about waking dreaming. Johannes Thomasius meets this spirit of his youth, and he has to, you know, he's constantly shared that he's meeting this out of a state of waking dreaming, which is very similar to this hypnagogic state that this man, Gary Lachman, says Swedenborg and Steiner were in. But that's a small thing in this journey with this figure of Johannes Thomasius. And I'm aware some people will have no idea of the characters in Steiner's mystery dramas and their development, but I just want to spend 10 minutes and then I'm done, really. I have last thoughts and I'll finish about 9:15. But I'll try and give a picture of this character, Johannes Thomasius, so you'll see his connection with this, what I've been talking about this evening. Johannes Thomasius is in many ways the hero. He's certainly the hero of Steiner's first mystery drama, and he's, you know, then one of the central figures, and very often the central figure. And he's an artist, and we see his path and we see his trials, great trials that he passes through. And those trials that he passes through are very, very similar to what Rudolf Steiner speaks about in relation to Swedenborg. And it's rather wonderful because what it means is that actually, you know, as I've said to you, Steiner's not dismissing Swedenborg at all, but he's saying, you know, the way Goethe could transform this into health, you know, if we just follow this in this way, it's you know, it's fairly limited, and it, you know, as spiritual experience, it's fairly limited. And with this character of Johannes Thomasius, you know, we see a transformation going on. Johannes Thomasius carries all the dangers, if you like, of a Swedenborgian approach, and then through the plays has to meet those dangers full on and fail very often, and go the path of slowly transforming it. So, for want of a better word, it's very kind, actually, of Rudolf Steiner. It's, Johannes Thomasius, for those who know the plays at all, gets a lot of things wrong. He really does. And if one works with the plays, as I have done, you very often find cast members and other people saying, what's this Johannes Thomasius? It's, he's way off, and how can he do all these things? But on not one occasion, to my awareness, is Johannes condemned by anybody or judged. And there's big people. There's Benedictus, the sort of son initiate, and there's Maria, who's highly developed, who's Johannes's friend. On not one occasion do they judge him. They actually do something that William Blake recommended, which Blake said, if the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. And in a certain way, to put it simply, Maria, particularly Maria, allows Johannes to persist in his folly, to go further with the way he is until he has to meet it and find what it is and develop further. So it's very kind, and it's a wonderful picture of the sort of transformation of this approach. Johannes Thomasius, you won't know this if you just quickly pick up the plays, but it's of interest if you hear Emerson and Blake talking about this sort of influence from the church working through Swedenborg, which certainly relates to what Steiner says about his previous incarnation. Johannes Thomasius in the Middle Ages had a very strong connection to the church, to the Catholic Church, and it's a one-sided connection. Steiner's quite clear about that. There are other characters who realize that they have to be open to other people too, and Johannes says, "No, I'm not doing that." He's in the Middle Ages, in the mystery dramas, you see this past life of the Middle Ages. And Johannes is a out and out follower of the church. Not quite militant, but he could be. So that's there. And then in the present life, he's an artist, and a very brilliant artist, and an artist who's also developed clairvoyance. So he's actually able to paint spiritually in a wonderful way that can have a hugely transformative effect on others. So in the first play, two characters, Strada and Capesius, see this painting Johannes has done, and both undergo a huge change just by meeting it. So, he's a very significant and wonderful person. But in the second play is called The Trial of the Soul, and they are all tested. The first play is a bit of a sort of fairy tale in a way. There's a very happy ending. And the second one, it's like, okay, now, you have to actually go through your trials for your ideals to become reality. And Johannes's first huge trial is, you'll see the connection with Swedenborg's moment of change, because what happens is that Maria, for reasons I won't go into, says to Johannes they need to separate from each other. And Johannes can't deal with this. Maria's been like a muse to him. He says, my whole work comes out of you. There's no way I can separate from you. And Johannes comes out in nature and says he refuses to accept this. There's no way he's accepting that Maria's cut him off. And in that moment, he sees his double, his doppelganger. Sure, you all got awareness of the double, but one's own untransformed self as a being coming towards one. And the double says to Johannes that he's actually full of sexual desire for Maria, which he's totally unconscious of. And Johannes freaks. He doesn't go, great, not at all. He says, how dare you speak such vile blasphemy against the highest, purest feelings of the heart. So can you see the connection again? It's like, okay, Swedenborg had these dreams, but it's a clairvoyance. He's not, I don't think Swedenborg would have said they had a sexual basis, his spiritual experiences. But now the double is saying, Johannes, this is underlying your clairvoyance, and you're saying, how dare you say that to me? The purest feelings of my heart. And then the double just says, well, it's true. And then a voice of conscience comes and says to Johannes, thus speaks kept down, concealed, suppressed, but neither mastered yet nor banished. Avoiding sight, so never showing, in the blood though throbbing, flowing, the secret power, the burning hidden fire of passion and desire. But that's the kind of voice of conscience. And Johannes is, hugely thrown by it. But can you see, it's very interesting because Swedenborg has this experience, which is not very comfortable. You remember those funny sort of beings, this liquid or something pouring out of him and coming into these worms and saying he'd eaten too much. It's quite interesting. It's not, and then later he says this was the Lord who taught him. But the beginning, I wonder to what extent the double's actually in there speaking to Swedenborg. But Swedenborg doesn't say that. He then says, then I received these teachings, and that became the beginning of his teaching. But for Johannes in that moment, he has to face it. If Swedenborg just slips by it, Johannes can't slip by it and has to face it. And that's the second play. Just leave the rest of that play. Go to the third play, and it heightens. Johannes's situation heightens to the highest degree. So you remember the Steiner saying that Swedenborg, what did you say, couldn't face the warnings of the guardian or something like that, the guardian of the threshold, whatever it was, would not pay careful heed to the warnings of the guardian of the threshold. It's very fascinating with Johannes Thomasius. He comes to the guardian of the threshold. On the stage, you have the guardian of the threshold visible and Johannes in front of him, front of the guardian. And Johannes says, I don't care what you say to me. You might say I'm not able to come across the threshold, but I'm coming past anyway. He's had a big connection with Lucifer by this stage, Johannes. And he says, filled with Lucifer, what Lucifer's given me, I will force my way past your threshold. It's very interesting. And, he can't fully come across. But what happens is very interesting because he has a clairvoyant experience, very clear. And he sees this figure from the past, this warrior figure. And I'm not going to explore this whole thing, but Johannes has overcome this situation with Maria, but has now fallen in love. Steiner says, fallen occultly in love. It's not about having a relationship on the earthly plane. This is what Steiner says, occult falling in love with this individual of Theodora, who has died and is beyond the threshold. And Johannes has a picture of this warrior, ancient warrior from the past, probably from ancient Greece or somewhere, and decides that this is the past life of Theodora, that he's seeing Theodora's past incarnation. And then he says, in a way to the audience, but he says, I've seen Theodora in a previous life. This shows that I have the right to love her. We must be so linked if I've seen her previous life that, it's totally justified that I, just live out my love for Theodora. And it isn't. It is not Theodora. It's probably a previous life of Johannes himself. But what's so fascinating is that we're given a full clairvoyant experience, and it's wonderful. It's, if you perform it, it's a wonderful picture. Once one has it with music and lighting, it's a very striking, clairvoyant picture of this warrior. But Johannes's vision is not correct. The guardian says something like images, like pictures, spiritual pictures, born of wishes, which is one translation, born of, with some desire element still there, often mask illusion. They often have illusion in them. And Johannes is finally made to face, he's finally actually ends up in Ahriman's role. And the guardian appears and he has to face what the guardian's bringing him, that this is not true. Partly because Johannes asked to go further. He says, then show me who it really is. And it's shown that actually his own double appears to him. not what he wanted, this blessed vision of Theodora, but he has to face his own double, and that it's of himself. But the reason I'm bringing it is because it's such a wonderful picture of illusion, and it is clairvoyance. There's no question. But is it known in the right way? Is the spiritual knowing correct, or has one had something which one's, it has not known correctly? Johannes is totally shattered by that when his double, he's faced with his double, he's just shattered. It's Johannes's thing to sort of go through these trials and then be shattered. But he comes through it. By doing that, he's able to actually let go of that. And then at the end of that play, he kind of stands in front of everybody, having taken this place in this transformed temple, and says, you know me personally. I'm, you all know I've got a lot of things badly wrong. So I'm not going to work out of that personal place. And through what I've been through, there's actually, I'm open to something higher. Actually says a second man has been created in me. And, I will allow that one to actually be here and do the work. So it's beautiful, and it's really beautiful. He's actually come through that and stands so naked and sort of free of all that other stuff before. That's the end of the third play. And in the fourth play, he has this thing which I'm not going to go into, but he has to learn that this is just an image. It's not a spiritual reality. It's just an image in the etheric realm. And then after that, he finally comes through to really seeing what his own karma is. It's a complex thing, and he finally is able to see what the real spiritual background is of his particular crisis that he's been living with all this time. And once he's done that, Benedictus says Johannes and Maria are now ready to actually work in the world in a really transformative way. They've come through their trials and they can actually be here. You remember with Swedenborg, I said this difficult thing of the risk of a spirituality that somehow allows the normal powers that be to go on their way, that are not working, not able to work fully to transform, the situation in the world. And Johannes's whole journey leads to, where Benedict says he's now ready and is able to actually really work transformatively in the world. So it's a wonderful journey. I may be just wrong, but it's my view that Steiner was aware of a Swedenborg element with Johannes, and shows a character sort of transforming all of that, in a good and healthy and very enjoyable way also. And just to finish, going to go back to sort of my question at the beginning. Perhaps I didn't voice as a question, but the question is sort of what's going on really. That these two individuals, Swedenborg and Rudolf Steiner, who are called by people like Gary Lachman to spiritual scientists, or people who are scientists and spiritualists, or what's happening with these two. And over a long time, I'll share my sense of it. And it's absolutely fine if people say they don't go along with that. But this is my own sense after some time living with it, is that with the Theosophical movement, with Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant, and that there's a whole drama of Madame Blavatsky, ending up in India, and Steiner goes into details of her really coming under very strong Indian influence, and Rudolf Steiner, takes this up and then takes up what Annie Besant's trying to do with the Theosophical Society, and says, this is not what's really asked for. That there needs to be a real, however you want to call it, real path of Christian initiation belonging to the West, not be pulled out to India. Anthroposophy begins Anthroposophy. With all that entails, and I've spoken of quite a lot of it, but obviously there's so much else with all of that entails. And those of us connected with Steiner's work are very aware of that story of Theosophy going the way it did, and the whole thing with Krishnamurti and Steiner then beginning Anthroposophy. But, and I don't have the quote, but I did find it once very clearly, there are people who say, who are not interested in Steiner's work at all, or they haven't encountered it, or they haven't experienced it, and say, in Europe at the time, Blavatsky was hugely important. The Theosophical movement was very important, and that kind of went off, either off to the east or somewhere, and there had to be a spirituality for the West. And we are the guardians of it. And that is, what I think is widely called the Western esoteric tradition, which is, very influential today in many places. And I'm not saying either there aren't very positive things and things one can learn, but it is different. It is different. And so this person I mentioned, Nicholas Goodrick Clark, who's a professor of the Western esoteric tradition, he's died now, who said to me, I couldn't understand Steiner, and now I realize he's just part of the Western esoteric tradition. I would say to him, respectfully, and he's not alive, that's not correct. It's not correct that Rudolf Steiner is just part of this Western esoteric tradition, which doesn't have the Christ being at its center, doesn't have, modern spiritual science at its center, is very much a tradition, is very much, based on these traditions, and Swedenborg's seen as, in a way, the sort of father of that tradition. Of course, it goes earlier, but he's seen as a, colossally important figure. So I think they're different, and I think that I hope it's been of some interest to you, but for myself, the work on this has actually helped me a lot to become clearer about what Rudolf Steiner is doing, what anthroposophy is. And in relation to Swedenborg, it's not to say, oh, it's terrible. It's, I can acknowledge, myself in that, if you like, but where that can be transformed. And hopefully that could also develop into a fruitful conversation with others too, many wonderful people who are involved in Swedenborgian groups in many ways. I think it would be wonderful if they could also meet ways in which it's transformed somehow, and where one can go further than it. So that's it. I hope it's not too long for you, but that's so far. I don't know if you want to break, Andrea. I'm very happy to have questions or anything. I don't know if you want to go straight on.
Yeah, dear Richard, thank you so much for your presentation. So my question, so do you need personally just a little break to restore your voice and have a
No,
sip
I'm
of
fine. I might have
water?
some water, but
You're good. Okay. So Richard has his hand raised. So Richard, go ahead. Richard? Richard
First of
Tucker?
all, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. And then in regard to that lady Sukar and all the sexuality, I just think it's very interesting that a comment that this humorist Gene Shepard made. He says, in each period of time, one of the 7 deadly sins is attacked and the others are let go. So in the Victorian time, lust was bad. And you could read all things how to curb your lust. He says, today it's a sin to be fat, but lust is in. So you can read all the things you want about lust, and it even carries over into her writings. So
thanks, Dick.
Thank you.
I mean, just to add, but I think you've got it, but thank you for that. It's very humorous. But, with Johannes Thomasius, very interesting, because Theodora dies and he's still wanting to connect with her in the spiritual world. And someone says, it's not an issue that she's died. It's to do with the character of his spirituality, which is, for want of a better word, kind of all over the place, and actually isn't coming from where it should be coming from.
Okay, thank you very much. So Becky McGrath. Hi, Becky.
Hi, thank you, Richard. That was incredible. Your ability to bring some of the most complex issues that the Deep Brotherhood try to hide, which is, first of all, that we should all be experiencing the lesser guardian of the threshold prior to crossing the threshold, is one of the greatest secrets that they've tried to hide from the masses. And so I really appreciate your delicacy, because I was like trying to hear where this also was in Swedenborg, because I wasn't hearing it in the descriptions of his evolving development of spiritual clairvoyance. And Mathilde von Magdeburg, who was a stigmata, also had this challenge where Rudolf Steiner said that her spiritual clairvoyance was inspired out of her lower sexual repressed nature, not transformed. So I think you're really hitting on something so important today that is so confused by humanity about the metamorphosis of this lower aspect of our being and its relationship to Lucifer. And I think he also said something in relationship that when we go into it's in the Secrets of the Threshold.
Yeah.
Yeah, the second chapter, he talks about how when somebody's going through, and I think this totally hits Thomasius, what you were talking about, when you go through initiation unconsciously, that then if you miss the mark of the initiation, then Lucifer takes all those forces that should have transformed into morality that would have helped humanity and the earth. Lucifer takes all this and then imbues into I imagine it as being injected into the individuality as more out of sexual inspirations, as opposed to it being true moral forces. And these are things that are so hidden. And it's also things that we know the secret brotherhoods use in their ways of working to even take hold of this clairvoyance that is being inspired by Lucifer and Ahriman, not necessarily coming from the Christ being. So I just want to tell you how grateful I am for how you brought it, the depth that you brought it in such a conscious way, unfolding how where this comes in as in a time period, and even us as anthroposophists on the path. This is what I love about the mystery dramas, this empathy and compassion for the other in their striving to really find their way through this is so complex and so difficult and so intimate for people to really be able to confront themselves. This kind of empathy and compassion in the mystery dramas, that it does have to be met and transformed, but we also have to hold people in our challenges to find our way in freedom. And with the true love of the Christ, this altruistic love, which Maria is this heightened individuality of total selflessness in the way she does this in relationship with, working with Benedictus and knowing what is the right time for the right thing in the right place, which sometimes we don't even ask that question. So anyway, I want to thank you for all you brought, and anything you could deepen, I would be grateful.
Thank you, Becky, very much. I'm not going to deepen anything, but just to say, you asked about Swedenborg, where that comes with the going past the guardian. It's probably in many places, it's probably a signature in a way. But I do think his experience itself, it's actually only quite recently I read that description of what happened at that moment of change. I was quite amazed. It's a very dark experience of all these vapors and dripping down and these things. But he doesn't say, I had to face something and face the lower guardian. The next minute, it's the Lord who's teaching him. So I think that's a significant place. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So Leon is next. Leon.
Hi. Where to start? 20 years before you went to Cambridge, I went through the Honors School of Natural Science at Oxford. And the professor of zoology there was Sir Alistair Hardy.
Great.
Partway through my studies, I discovered, he's president of the British Society for Psychic Research.
Right.
I had various dabblings and issues which made me very interested in this subject. So he and I became friends after he retired, and he gave the Gifford lectures, as you may know, trying to relate evolution with spirituality. It was very conservative. It was like Darwinian evolution and Church of England spirituality. but it was sincere. And he started a unit when he retired for the study of religious experience. And he created a department that was very much a rebirth of natural history with the founders of ecology and ethology, which I went into. But I always kept an interest in spiritual, no, not spiritual, but psychic research, shall we say. And when I came to the United States, I went to a talk on Edgar Cayce by a geologist who didn't believe in any of this stuff, but he was very good scientist, and he gave it very honestly. And he was a geologist, and he talked about Edgar Cayce's earth change predictions and how they related to the Richter scale map and things like of that nature. So as soon as I could, I went and met the son of Edgar Cayce and also other people there. And I wanted to raise Edgar Cayce as another example of this kind of related phenomena, but different.
Yeah.
Like a lot of anthroposophists criticize him like he's not awake, he's not fully awake. And in case they don't know, he gave readings for himself about his previous lives. And he described how it was fully conscious in his previous life. And he used it as a riverboat gambler to make money. And in this life, he was unable to make any money, even if it was for really wonderful causes, like his hospital and so on. He tried all sorts of things, but he couldn't do that. So one of the people I met there did his PhD. He did several PhDs apparently at Harvard, but he did his PhD on Cayce when he was a graduate student. And he gave a talk once on how different movements persist and don't persist. And this was in the 70s. I went to this talk, and he was questioning whether Edgar Cayce's work would be, persistent, and whether it would fade off as the family lost its direct influence and so on and so forth. And he talked a lot about Swedenborg as an example of a movement that had faded off. And later on, when I moved to LA, I went to see a Swedenborgian church. This was in the 80s now, and it was quite empty. And so my first question, getting around to this, is this interest in Swedenborg pretty recent? Because
well, it's a very good question. I think it's a very good question, because as you say, I mean, first of all, I'm not a great, I haven't gone following and looking into all the details of where the Swedenborg churches are and things like this. But certainly as a church, I totally agree with you. It's had its day a long time ago. But the influence seems to have spread. I mean, you get Conan Doyle saying that Swedenborg's this vast figure at the beginning of all spiritualism. And now I think what is recent is this coming into the science. I showed this book, Swedenborg and the New Paradigms in Science. And that's connecting Swedenborg to David Bohm, Fritjof Capra, Rupert Sheldrake, and Albert Einstein. So, maybe that's new. People say, oh, well, something like the Scientific Medical Network, people looking for those bridges between modern science and spirituality.
Well, I had the privilege of spending an afternoon with David Bohm, and I can't relate to that at all. David Bohm was a student of Krishnamurti, though.
Yeah.
So there's a connection in that way. But Krishnamurti, long after he had left his role in the Theosophical Society, when he was basically teaching invite doubt.
He became an incredible person, absolutely. Yeah.
I have another question while I got the floor here, and that's about this sexual nature of some ways into psychism. And these series of lectures that you put up about communities and so on, I always wondered, why did Steiner give lectures about that? Why didn't he deal with it in person with the people? Did he kind of see ahead of things that wasn't going to work?
Well, we probably we could talk a long time about this one, Leon. But for those who don't know, this was a situation with a lady called Alice Sprengel, who's of some interest in all sorts of, Rosicrucian groups. But Alice Sprengel was in the mystery dramas and was firmly of the view, when Rudolf Steiner married Steiner, Alice Sprengel said she'd had a spiritual experience of Rudolf Steiner saying that they would be married, him and Alice Sprengel, and that he belonged to her and not to Mary Steiner. and then it's complicated because there was all sorts of spiritual groups involved as well. But he clearly tried to deal with it personally, but it didn't work. I mean, because he ends up reading out letters to the members of the society, trying to show how he tried to deal with it. But it's interesting because he then goes into all this, as you know, goes into Swedenborg and goes into this whole thing with the sexuality, and goes into Alice Sprengel. He said we should now call Swedenborgianism Sprengelism. He says we need to be able to talk about this today, or we're not going to become clear if we can't actually address this openly. So there's dealing with it personally, but he obviously also felt, this is going to be important. I've also felt that to be relevant, that he said, we've got to become able to discuss this. Otherwise we can't get forward with what we're trying to do.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Leon, very much. I totally agree about the complexity of individuals. I'm totally with you. One cannot get into some generalizing thing. Individuals are complex and, huge.
You done? Yeah, thank you so much. So Nicola is next. Nicola, can you unveil yourself?
Nicola.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Hi.
Okay. So yeah. So I've come between you and Leon because I think I was at Cambridge doing maths before you were there, Richard, and then probably after you were in Oxford, Leon.
I went in 1980.
Yeah. And I'm, what you're saying about transforming thinking and transforming science. I mean, that's my mission, is transforming technical mathematics because it's deeply spiritual, and that's not realized. But that's, but my question is, goes back to something you were saying. Steiner said the 25th of August, 2023, that what Swedenborg was seeing were reflections of the spiritual world in the etheric. If he'd taken heed of the warnings of the guardian of the threshold, he would have gone through to see something astral. I didn't quite get it because I think it's actually, in a way, it's beyond. I mean, I'm still struggling.
Beyond me too. To be honest, Nicola, but it's just incredibly. It's also very fascinating with Johannes, that particular situation, because there's when he sees this spirit of his youth, he gets into this conversation like, what is the reality? What sort of reality is this? And then he gets an answer which is very close to this. That it's real, but it's also a picture at the same time as being real. So these etheric forces, which Steiner says is what Swedenborg was seeing, are not the angels nor the archangels themselves, but forces vibrating in the ether. Today, it is abnormal for anyone to see into these hidden etheric forces, which do in fact project an etheric image of the higher spiritual archetypes into the surrounding ether. And then he says that what in Swedenborg's case, coming as it did in the form of etheric images, was unconscious imagination, will, brackets, if one pays careful heed to the warnings of the guardian of the threshold, which Swedenborg was unable to do, go through a metamorphosis and reappear as fully conscious astral inspiration.
Fully conscious astral inspiration.
Probably best just to read the lecture. It's right at the end of the 25th August 1923 lecture.
It's
Coming to England and trying to help people understand.
And what's that lecture called?
Well, it's called The Evolution of Consciousness.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, super. Thank you. Yeah, that'll take a little bit.
Exactly.
A lot of study. Thank you.
Another question for everybody. I know you're in America, but well, you're not, Nicola. Presumably you're in England, are you?
Yeah, I'm in England.
What has England got to do with it? I mean, Swedenborg has this experience in England. He dies in England. You know, Steiner speaks about his karma in England, and this lecture here is in England also. So there's something that is significant for the Western world somehow.
All right, thank you. So Claire on the floor.
Hey, hello, thank you, Richard, for this. I've always been interested in both of these figures, Blake and Swedenborg, since I was very young. What parallels do you see there in Faust's journey with sexuality and then ending up in the true spiritual realm and being redeemed by the eternal feminine? When you look at Johannes Thomasius and you look at Swedenborg, you can see this archetype there in Faust. So what would you say about that?
Well, I'd say, first of all, it's a great connection to make. And, I think it's a wonderful connection to make. I don't quite know what to make of it. I mean, certainly, saying that Blake and Goethe, I think they're spiritual brothers somehow. And there's all of Blake's later work, like his Milton. I don't know if you know his Milton, but
yes,
there's the Book of Job, which is, it's however many, 20 plates or something, etching. It's an incredible journey. That's his own Faust somehow.
Yeah.
Has to go through that.
I mean, it's interesting that the figures have to go through the sexuality.
Yeah.
Faust had to go through the degradation of that in order to reach the highest.
Yeah.
Almost like they have to go through these levels of the spiritual world in order to reach this true image of the feminine. It's always the opposing powers giving you these images and you think they're true, but they're not. They're illusions, right?
It's very interesting, that, Claire, because with Blake, as you probably know, this issue about Swedenborg being such a sort of church figure, for Blake, I can't say for Goethe, but certainly for Blake, the church was just completely upside down. It claimed morality and was completely immoral. Yeah. And he says the whole thing was inverted, Swedenborg included. So what Swedenborg calls angels, are actually devils instead of abstract figures.
Yeah.
The devils, the ones he calls devils, are the ones with the inspiration.
Yeah.
That's the kind of, the thing of romanticism, isn't it? And Goethe, I think it's wonderful you bring it, because they're radical figures and they have to take it on in the right way and not sort of let it be unaddressed and then work and have a sort of false picture of what heaven and hell is.
Right. It's a huge theme. You better get writing another book. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Really, thank you for the question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. Karen? Hi.
Karen File.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes,
Hi. I'm Karen File. I'm with the Swedenborg Library in downtown Chicago, and I've enjoyed listening to your talk. Thank you, Richard. I just wanted to maybe help out on a couple things that were a little confusing. One of the late comments about, the church is small, and is it going to survive? And one of the paradoxes of Swedenborgianism is that Swedenborg envisioned a new church that would be within us. So it's paradoxical that any church groups grew up in the first place. Swedenborg makes no call for a church temporal to be organized. That was not the vision that he was seeing. So within the theology itself, there's no call to form organizations. He thought that we were at the cusp of a great change. And early Swedenborgians took inspiration from things like the American Revolution and so forth after his death, that there were clear signs that something was happening in the reordering of the spiritual world that we would experience. So yes, the church is still alive. There are still groups around, but that is one of the problems that Blake had with it as well. As he read Swedenborg, he was frustrated with the sort of bourgeois, typical church organization that was organized in London. And he thought that that was not what they should be doing at all. And he broke actually with the church. That was his issue. So, I just wanted to mention, there's a little book called New Jerusalem from the Swedenborg Foundation. And I call this the brochure of Swedenborg. He wrote 30 volumes. And if you want to get a quick top line understanding of his theology, you would do well just to read the New Jerusalem. You can download it from free from Swedenborg.com, the Swedenborg Foundation. And other people will think you're an absolute genius and scholar in Swedenborg just by reading that one little book, because most people have not wanted to wade through all of his work, but it is fun, especially his work on Revelation. That's what I would suggest that you take a look at. And I'm not that familiar. I've only read a little bit of Steiner. I'm not that familiar with him to comment on parallels or differences.
Very much. Thank you. I've got a question to you, if I may, which is, you know that Swedenborg said in 1757, which for those of you who
Second Coming has happened.
The Second Coming has happened. What did he call it? He called it the great
well, you know, we refer to it as a second coming because that's how Christians think of it. What he was saying was it was a reordering of the heaven and the hells in order to retain man's freedom of will, that to the Lord that is of the utmost importance that our freedom of will be maintained, and that it goes way beyond anything in this planet. It was a reordering of heaven and hell and the forces of good and evil. And for Swedenborg, what's important is the idea of good and love, which is good, and wisdom and knowledge. It's those, he's always talking about that coupling. There is no wisdom without love. There is no love without wisdom. You need both of them. And when you said that he got to the point where his knowledge, he couldn't get there. And just by the way, his father was an important Lutheran bishop. They were a pietist family. He grew up with the idea as a Swede, angels in the grass, you know, invisible friends. I mean, you know, this is a factor of people where there's not many people per square mile. They have more of those kind of experiences, and a little bit like the fairies, you know. I mean, if you've grown up like that, you understand that. But no, his father was a Lutheran bishop.
But my question, Karen, if I may, was about this 1757. So the 1757 was the last judgment or something. It was this huge, significant date. And for William Blake was born in 1757. So that's thing for him.
I see.
Born at this moment of the sort of turning of time. But I learned today, I must confess, that Swedenborg was 57 when he has this experience in London. So I just wondered if anybody anywhere has said, you know, whether this 1757 has something of the significance of the year 57 for Swedenborg or not.
Well, you know, I mean, you know, taking with a grain of salt, that's when he said it happened. You know, Swedenborg was a man, and when you read him, you know, you need to take that into account. There are some people that would put him on a pedestal, like, you know, this is the last word. But the American original, what's called the General Convention of Swedenborgians, that's not the way they look at it. So it's useful. useful information. And the reason I'm a Swedenborgian, and I discovered in midlife, in my 20s, you know, when you're no longer in structured situations, you're out of school, it's you against the world. The reason I became interested in it is what I would attest to is he articulates the way the Lord works with us. Once you understand that, you increase your willingness and ability to work with what the Lord is giving you every day. And we would call a lot of these things synchronicities, but they're very detailed, very personal. And it's like the idea of flow. You know, the other thing that comes, you're talking about Goethe, you come into modern artists, a lot of them will talk about flow. That idea that you're receiving something and learn to go with it. Because in your experience, when you do, good things happen. When you don't, an accident happens or something that's not so good. So it's a matter of developing that muscle to listen. And as someone said earlier, ask before you act. Is this what we should be doing here? So that's the why people are Swedenborgians, because they learn that works in your personal life. And it's the old saying, if it's written on your heart, it's your life experience that leads you to be thankful that he was able to articulate all this stuff and spend 30 years of his life trying to understand the spiritual world after dedicating his first life to trying to understand the natural world.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And that statue is our monument to Swedenborg in Lincoln Park at Lakeshore Drive in Diversey.
Oh,
and important Swedenborgians in Chicago, Daniel Burnham, first city planner, Charles Bonney initiated the first World Parliament of Religions, because Swedenborgian is very ecumenical. Swedenborg says all faiths are found in heaven. Nobody's got a lock on it. And the other thing that might be of interest to you, his book, True Christianity, is all the polemics he had of the time in the 1700s among the Christian churches. What was wrong with the Lutheran Church? What was wrong with the Catholic Church? You know, what these misunderstandings that they had were. That True Christianity contains all of those polemics of the 1700s.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yes. Richard, so in Chicago, we have a strong correlation to Swedenborgian Church, which is in Chicago downtown. And I'm living here in my area, only 5 minutes walk from Loyola University, so which is a Catholic university. And as anthroposophists, for some point we have to mention, so according to research of Rudolf Steiner, the previous incarnation of Swedenborg was Ignacio Loyola. So, and first of all, I just noticed, so it was very, very short time between incarnations, because, for example, I remember Society or Jesuit order was established in Paris 1595, and Swedenborg was born, you said, in 1688, right? Yeah, very short incarnation. So, and Ignacio Loyola, he has also pretty strong spiritual experience, specifically when he was as brave Celtic, not Celtic, yes, Celtic, he was Basque. He was wounded, and he was laying in the hospital, and this is how, during this particular condition, he got certain inspirations from spiritual world, and Society of Jesus was established after. So, do you have any notes about those two incarnations, as how, for example, Swedenborg with Ignacio Loyola with his pretty strong spiritual qualities and organizational qualities, he was transformed into Swedenborg?
Well, there's a book, Andre, but it's only in German by Ludwig Noll about this, and it's it's really quite good. I would have liked it to go somehow into the areas that I was interested in, but that's not the task. The task is really to look at these two individuals, and I remember it being really good. He goes deeply into this wound. It was a battle wound, wasn't it, that Loyola had, And
Yeah,
he
in his black, I believe. Yeah.
and Knoll was a doctor. So you know, it's published by Perseus Press. You know, this is Thomas Meyer's organization in used to be Basel.
Yeah. Okay.
So whether someone could translate it, because it's really, you know, Ludwig Knoll took different situations that Steiner had spoken about, people's previous lives, and explored them and wrote on them very well, actually. But yeah, it's another theme. It's a big theme. But thank you for bringing it at the end.
Well, I must, because I mean, we cannot miss this particular topic.
But it's a big one, you know. It's
a big topic. I mean, maybe it's a good topic for another presentation, if you're brave enough.
If what?
If you are brave enough.
Exactly. Yeah. Anyway,
okay, I mean,
it's 10 o'clock. And
yeah, dear friends, it's already 10 p.m. in London. So, and maybe we have to conclude. And I would like to mention, so Richard will give another talk for my platform, for our platform, on January 30th. And this is talk all about Christmas Foundation meeting.
December the 30th.
December 30th, yeah. Do you remember, right, Richard?
Yeah, you said January the 30th. It's
Oh,
December.
I'm sorry, December. My bad. And yes, and I'd like to also invite you. There will be another try of Steve Usher to give a presentation, same presentation, which didn't happen 1 week ago. So he will try to do it on December 16th at 2 o'clock. So, Richard, I know you are colleagues with Steve Usher, so yeah,
yes,
please
I
also come.
haven't seen it for a long time, but yeah. Give me the date again. December
16th.
16th. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
So that's 8 p.m. in UK time, same time as here.
8 p.m. in Stroud.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, thank you all for listening.
Dear Richard, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and your soul mood, and such friendly atmosphere which you created. So thank you so much. So dear friends, if you would like to just unmute your machines and thank Richard, and yeah, we will finish.
Great.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very
Richard.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy Christmas.
Merry Christmas to all of you.
Merry
Absolutely.
Christmas.
Thank you very much.
God bless. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Yeah, good night, dear friends.